Welcome back to the Josh Kane Presidential Fireside Chat. The wheels have come off this show. This episode was supposed to be out for June 1st, but I've had a rough 6 weeks. Off and on, I've either had a cold, allergies, and now I'm battling Corona for the first time. I'm on fumes, but I wanted to get this episode out, especially given current events. And I also want to get out from under the Gilded Age. But we've been building towards this episode for like 10 months. So I didn't want to keep you waiting. So if I keel over dead during this recording, know that I died doing what I love, yelling at you people, trying to get you to read and travel more. So I'm going to do my best. I've still got great book recommendations here at the end, as long as I can make it to the end. But we're on to episode number 221, the stolen presidential election of 1876 and the death of Reconstruction. Again, we have been building to this. This is probably one of the most, certainly the major event of the Gilded Age, and certainly one of the biggest events in American history. I don't know why we don't talk about it more. It's so insane, this election, and really Reconstruction in general. I feel like when we're taught about the Civil War, like Lincoln's assassinated, Civil War ends, and we just kind of move forward, and that's obviously not the case. Reconstruction lasts in the South from 1865 to 1877, so it's like 12 years of Reconstruction. When Lincoln's assassinated, Lincoln, I know I beat up on Lincoln here. He's the only president in American history that never had to govern the South. Let's face it, the South was ungovernable, and maybe certain parts of this country continue to be ungovernable. But he's the only president that was never responsible for the South. He's assassinated, and I said this during season 1, and I still believe it. They say more books have been written about him except for Jesus Christ. He was the martyred president. He couldn't have died at a more perfect time to be forever remembered. He never had to implement anything in the South. He had really had nothing planned. None of the amendments had been passed. Even the 13th Amendment, which obviously he's credited for, didn't pass until December of 1865, 8 months after he had died. So the 13th, the 14th, 15th Amendments, none of that exists in Lincoln's lifetime. Obviously, it's his legacy, but who knows? Who knows what it would have happened had he lived and he actually had to get down to the governing of the South and trying to rebuild the South. What we do know is Andrew Johnson made... I mean, if you just did the opposite of whatever Andrew Johnson did, you'd probably be doing okay. He was terrible. He made all the wrong decisions. He essentially hands the South back to the Confederates. They're allowed to go right back to what they were doing. All forms of government, governors, judges, you name it. They go right back into their way of life. Obviously, it's greatly changed. They don't, many of their farms and plantations had been destroyed, but they go right back into, running things their way and doing everything they can to prevent black people from rising up at all. Briefly during this period, after the 14th and 15th Amendments pass, black folks do get the right to vote. And in a handful of these southern states, they're the majority of residents. And, for a while there was some black congressmen, a senator, I believe even a lieutenant governor. So but not just that, it was all levels of government, juries, police officers, people rose up pretty quickly in a lot of these southern states, but they were under constant harassment from the ex-Confederates, who would go on to form the original KKK in 1865. And they were they were essentially terrorists, terrorizing black folks, trying to prevent them from, at a minimum, from voting, taking on any type of positions of power in the South. They wanted them to basically stay in a form of slavery in the South. So, and Johnson does everything he can to help them. And eventually Congress steps in. They start overriding his vetoes. they establish that they're a third co-equal branch of government, and start implementing a lot of these things, pushing through. Obviously, they passed the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was done under Johnson, and then the 15th Amendment was done under Ulysses S. Grant. So, and again, Johnson is impeached. He falls one vote short of being removed from office, being convicted in the Senate. Again, impeachment is just a political trial. So you have to think about the politics involved in impeachment back then. They were setting themselves up. They were setting Grant up for their future presidency in '68. And it's, again, interesting. Like, what if Lincoln had survived? Like, would Grant have ever become president? Like, who knows? What if Lincoln was so popular he got a third term? Like, it's just so many unknowns. People dedicate their lives studying Reconstruction. We're briefly just touching on it. I have a handful of books that I'm going to recommend at the end. I'm not going to be able to scratch the surface on Reconstruction, but I find it one of the most fascinating times in American history. The Gilded Age, Reconstruction. There's just a lot going on. But over time, Reconstruction becomes unpopular even in the North. Obviously, it's unpopular in the South, but it becomes politically unpopular in the North as well. And maybe a lot of that has to do with, the South, fake news coming out of the South about how terrible black people were governing. Most of it's nonsensical, but nothing we can do about that now. So leading up to the election of 1876, Grant decides not to run for a third term. Most people thought he would. So part of the problem with Grant's administration, he surrounded himself with some pretty sleazy characters. I mean, the Gilded Age is filled with sleazy characters. So it might just be a sign of the times. There was a lot of corruption in the Grant administration, not by Grant himself. He seems like a pretty good guy. Like, he just surrounded himself with really terrible people. So they have a huge scandal with the railroads, and, the robber barons are celebrated for building America. But let's not forget there was a ton of corruption in building those railroads across it, which we don't have time to get into, but you read a lot about this time period. The corruption in politics is like unbelievable. So leading up into the election, we have, political corruption, the Reconstruction. We still had many states in the South were still occupied by federal troops. You had the constant harassment and terrorism towards the black folks, trying to prevent them from voting in the South. This is kind of like to set the scene of the election. And the Republicans nominate Rutherford B. Hayes. He's kind of like unknown outside of Ohio, but Ohio is a pretty important swing state at this point. So they could have nominated a cardboard box from Ohio, I guess. So Rutherford B. Hayes, he wins the nomination just because he really was scandal-free. He served valiantly in the Civil War. He was wounded 5 times. So he's ultimately a pretty good guy. So he's not to blame for the stolen election necessarily. And obviously, the Democrats nominate my man Samuel Tilden, longtime friend and partner of my man Andrew Haswell Green. If you haven't watched that episode yet, you really need to shut this one off and go back. I really laid it all on the field or at the gravesite in that instance. But Tilden, he rises to popularity. Again, if you watch the Andrew Haswell Green, from taking down the political corruption in New York. So he, springboards him to the nomination for governor of New York. And then again, New York and Ohio are the 2 biggest states at the time for electoral votes. So he leads the ticket. And in the end, in the election of 1876, the final count, Tilden wins the popular vote by 250,000 plus votes. And there's disputed elections in 4 states: Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon. Now, we're never going to be able to get into this in great detail, but again, I have great books to recommend. But Tilden allegedly wins in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, and Hayes wins in Oregon. But the electoral vote at that time, you only needed 185 votes to win. And at the end of the initial count, Tilden has 184 votes to Hayes' 165. So Tilden only needs one vote to win the election. And the 4 states combined are 20 electoral votes. So Tilden only needed to win one of the 4 states. And the political machine immediately jumps into action, specifically on the Republican side. South Carolina allegedly had 101% voter turnout. So 101% of the eligible voters turned out in South Carolina. Obviously, there's tons of fraud, tons of violence towards black folks, preventing them from going to the polls, which at that time were voting Republican. You had a place like Florida and Louisiana. Again, it looked like Tilden was in the lead in both states, but Republicans were still in charge of those 2 states. Federal troops were still in some of these states. And both those states actually sent dual electors, one set of electors for Republican Hayes and one set for Tilden. So it was a real constitutional crisis. Hayes was winning in Oregon, but the governor was Democrat, and he tried to expunge or expel one of the electors. So it was a huge mess. They were trying to get the vote thrown into the House, where Tilden would have won based on the rules of how the elections are counted. But again, no one wanted to go in that direction. So President Grant signs into law the Electoral Commission in late January of 1877. So the election is held in November of 1876. So this is dragging on, and we're in late January. At this time, the inauguration was not on January 20th, but it was on March 4th. It didn't change until Franklin Roosevelt. So this thing dragged on and on and on. So a commission was created in late January of 1877 that included 15 members, 5 from the House of Representatives, 5 from the Senate, and 5 Supreme Court justices. I mean, this was like a big deal. The election, and I failed to mention, the election of 1876 is actually the high water mark in this country for voter turnout. It was like 83% of eligible voters turned out to vote. So like this was a huge deal, high voter turnout. I mean, to put that into perspective now, we barely hit like 60% of eligible voters. I think this last election in 2020, like 66%, still far short of the 83% of eligible voters in 1876. So this, again, was a super controversial vote. But the group of 15 people, again, 5 senators, 5 congressmen, and 5 Supreme Court justices, were split basically 8-7 Republicans over Democrats. And in the end, after months of negotiating, or a month and a half, let's say, of back and forth, they do end up just voting along party lines. And Hayes is given the election 8-7. So that's how the election is basically decided in a smoky back room. And you can't help but wonder, and this isn't really brought up, and we talked about it a little bit last time, Tilden was most likely gay. And it's just interesting to think about. They obviously had to have talked about it. You'd love to have been in that room when they're fighting over who wins the election. Had to have come up. I mean, the poor guy was drawn, again, in political cartoons, constantly wearing a dress. He's attacked for being overly feminine and what have you, dressing in fancy clothing and all that, not having a beard. So I don't know. It probably wouldn't have mattered. The people voted down party lines. So at the end of the day, Hayes had 8 people in the room and Tilden only had 7, and the vote was 8-7. But it's just interesting to think about. It had to have come up. It's not written anywhere. They talked about it in those back smoky rooms. So the election actually wasn't decided until March 2nd, 2 days before the inauguration. Both candidates happened to be in Washington because no one knew who was going to win. So it's fascinating. The stolen election of 1876. Hayes comes right out of the gate and says he's only serving 1 term, which basically made him immediately a lame duck. They called him his fraudulency, Rutherford Hayes. Now, going forward, no president has ever said they're only going to serve 1 term because, again, it makes them immediately a lame duck. Tilden goes on. He sort of becomes a recluse. He leads the nomination in 1880 and 84, but he declines to run. That was his health wasn't all that great, and he dies in 1886, leaving Andrew Haswell Green a pallbearer in his funeral, an executor of his will, where he disperses, and he has a pretty substantial fortune, like in today's dollars, like a couple $100 million. And he uses that money to build the New York Public Library. So Andrew Haswell Green, longtime friend of Samuel Tilden, uses his power to help build the New York Public Library. So, so that's a stolen election. I worry that this playbook could be used in the future. Sending multiple electors, and I think in the coming days we're going to learn that maybe that was attempted in 2020, trying to send multiple electors, trying to get the election ultimately handed to the House of Representatives to decide, which is total nonsense. I hate that happened. All this stolen election rhetoric out of people, I have to admit, makes me insane. It's so lazy and dopey. Don't fall for it. The previous president lost the election. You may not like the results, but the idea that it was stolen and all these nutty conspiracy theories, how about you read a book? Some of these conspiracy theories are so lazy. Although I do have a favorite, that election boxes full of ballots also had a dusting of bamboo. Not only do you sound dopey, but the dusting of racism on top of it really puts it over the top. So enough with the stolen election of 2020. You don't know what you're saying. Every theory has been debunked. Every theory is nuttier than the next. Luckily, I'm sick, because I'd really be going crazy. All right, book recommendations. I'm telling you, at the end of the day, this might be the most important book that I ever recommend. This is like a blueprint of how to steal a presidential election. And a lot of those things, things still exist to do this, which is pretty scary. Hopefully Congress can get their act together and kind of close a lot of these loopholes. But this is an excellent book. It gives you a blow-by-blow of how the election of 1876 was stolen. I can't recommend this book enough. I'm starting to fall apart here at the end. This is a great book too. Again, The Death of Reconstruction. This lady's super smart. It almost makes me crazy how smart she is. I don't always agree with her, but she tells it like it is and then ties it to historical events. So she's actually worth following on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. She's real smart. So, but this book is good. The Death of Reconstruction. This next book is insane. I had never heard of this. The Wilmington's Lie. Again, 1898. This is after Reconstruction. Wilmington was the second biggest city in North Carolina. It had a mostly black population. And then the white folks just terrorized the black people leading up to the election. And even when the election didn't quite go the way they wanted, they just overthrew everybody. Got rid of the mayor, the city council, the police chief, just overthrew everything. It is a wild story that I'd never heard before. You really should read this. This is 1898, not that long ago. People in Wilmington still debate this issue, and it's their grandparents essentially were involved in this, and no one wants to admit fault. But people lost their businesses, they lost their lives. Black folks never had a chance in this area, which is completely not right. And then finally, more of a lighthearted read, Saving the Yellowstone. Yellowstone becomes the nation's first national park in 1872 during Reconstruction. So if you're planning on going to Yellowstone, it's kind of a fun read. It's talking about the founding and what was going on in the country. So definitely worth reading. One other thing, you think about this, I think it's still on the books. It was as of a year or so ago. There's a law on the books from 1880s Mississippi that has successfully prevented any black people from winning statewide races like governor, senator, etc. So the idea that Reconstruction or racism, it still doesn't haunt us. Take a look at that law in Mississippi. That's, again, I think it's still on the books from I think it's 1890. All right. Recommendations. TV shows, I don't know if you're watching The First Lady on Showtime. It's okay. It should be better than it is. I don't necessarily know if I love it, but it's worth tuning in. It's pretty interesting information. I just don't really like the how they keep jumping around from the three different first ladies. But check it out. It's pretty good. And then movie recommendation, totally unrelated. Top Gun Maverick. I mean, that movie it's tremendous. It's maybe a billion times better than the first, and I loved the first movie. So the new Top Gun is excellent, totally worth your money. If you're looking for someone to go with, once I'm recovered from the Rona here, I would go with you again. It's terrific. And then just travel recommendation. I guess there's a Reconstruction era National Historic Park in Beaufort, South Carolina. I haven't been. Reconstruction to me, again, we could go, there's probably thousands of books written about it, and they're all probably interesting. It's just an interesting time in American history. So I would like to go there at some point in my life. And I know I'm going way over. I'm like sweating, coughing. Up next is the series finale of the Gilded Age. I'm going to leave it a surprise. See if anybody's even still watching the show. I'm going to give you a few hints. This person was basically at every major event from the end of the Civil War throughout the Gilded Age, but he lived his life in the shadow. He's got major ties to the D.C. area, and when I was in D.C. last August, when I talked myself into doing this show again, I was surprised when this person just sort of jumped out at me, and I was like, whoa. And I sat on him in my mind for like months, and I talked myself into him being the, well, it's a guy, I guess, the series finale. And I hadn't read any books. I was dependent on the book being great. And the book is great, along with other books that I read that tie to the last guest of the Josh Kane Presidential Fireside Chat. So see if you can guess who was at every major event of the Gilded Age and has ties to the DC area. I wish you luck. Hopefully I'll be back feeling better next week to try and I'll try and get the episode out for the 15th of the month, and then we'll be done with the Josh Kane Presidential Fireside Chat. Well, that's the stolen election. I know there's going to be big news tied to current events. You should try and read that book I recommended to see how things are happening. 2024 it's not looking good if people have their way. All right, bye for now.